At the moment, the West does not want to survive. It has a death wish. It has told itself, or its elites have told itself, it is rubbish, it is awful, it is evil, it was born in evil, it has to be replaced by something completely different, and is not producing children. It is literally dying.
Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an important conversation for you with Melanie Phillips about the implications of the British and French elections for those countries and the spread of anti-Semitism around the globe. But before we begin, I want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, you don't have to wait a full week for more of our content. There is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily podcast under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. Britain and France voted in the last 2 weeks, and the results were, in both cases, good news for the political left. The populist right is on the rise throughout Europe as concerns about immigration and the pervasive influence of Islamists on the national character and security of those countries rises. But at least for now, the political establishments in both the UK and France remain largely in control and lack interest in addressing those questions. Yet the problems that have led to the rise of the National Rally Party in France, which went from the margins to the mainstream in the last 2 decades, and now the rise of the Reform Party in Britain, as mainstream conservatives seem to have discredited themselves, is a major story. The future of Europe is very much in question, but so is the future of European Jewry, which must now contemplate life in France and other nations, where vicious Israel haters and anti-Semites who are beholden to and eager to appease Islamists have gained power. Traditional conservatives, who were more interested in the status quo than in listening to their voters, are largely discredited. Unlike in the United States, where Republicans have heeded their voters, even as elites blasted them as fascists, European conservatives seem more worried about being called racists than in doing something about the problems facing their nation. The lesson here is fairly obvious. Parties, even historically successful ones like Britain's Conservatives, aren't going to succeed by ignoring their voters and national concerns. In France, faced with a choice between radical leftists and anti-Semites and right-wing populists, on the other hand, the establishment in both France and the UK have chosen to empower the left. In Britain, the Tories seemed content to hand over the country to the left rather than make common cause with those who question their failures. Whether that will, in the long run, lead to a fundamental change in their politics, or the continent's drift further towards a future of socialism and Islamism, as well as even greater hostility to Israel, is yet to be seen. But as different as the politics of those countries may well be, there are lessons here for Americans who worry about the implications of ignoring the needs of their country's working class, and the way they have been harmed by unlimited immigration and open borders, as well as the way the woke left has mainstreamed anti-Semitism. Rather than ignore European politics, Americans who fear for the future of the Jewish community, as well as whether embracing conservative populism is a lifeline or a threat, need to pay heed to what's happening across the pond. To further discuss all this and more, we're fortunate to have with us today one of the most powerful voices of reason commenting on public affairs, as well as someone I'm proud to call a colleague and a member of the JNS team. Melanie Phillips is a journalist, broadcaster, and author who has championed traditional values in the culture war for more than 3 decades. She writes a weekly column in the Times of London, as well as for JNS, and regularly broadcasts on the BBC. She's the author of a novel, The Legacy, and a personal and political memoir, Guardian Angel. Her previous books include her 2006 bestseller, Londonistan, about the British establishment's capitulation to Islamist aggression, and The World Turned Upside Down, the Global Battle Over God, Truth, and Power, published in 2010. In addition to reading her on JNS, you can follow Melanie's work at her Substack. Melanie Phillips, welcome to Think Twice.
Hello, Jonathan. Very good to be with you again.
Well, Melanie, thanks so much for joining us today and being back on the program. I want to start by asking you about whether foreign perceptions of Britain's new Prime Minister and government are correct. For those who don't pay close attention to British politics, their thumbnail understanding of the situation was that after the 2019 British general election, Jeremy Corbyn, the very radical and arguably anti-Semitic leader of the Labour Party, was tossed out, not just out of the leadership, but out of the party by the new leader, Sir Keir Starmer, was a Jewish wife and children, steered his party back to the center, and that therefore this election means that Britain is in for a period of center-left government, good relations with Israel, and that British Jews who were deeply frightened by Corbyn, not to mention the mass pro-Hamas rallies in London since October 7th, are safe. Is that all true?
Not quite. The first bit is true. Jeremy Corbyn was the hard left, very anti-Israel, anti-Jewish leader. At least he presided over a very anti-Jewish party, put it more accurately. Keir Starmer got rid of him, and Keir Starmer also set out to purge, really rather ruthlessly, the Labour Party of the faction of which Jeremy Corbyn was the leader, the hard left faction. And he purged them very spectacularly and very deliberately because he wanted to show the British people, and particularly the Jewish community in Britain, that it was again safe to vote Labour. Now, in my view, this was largely cosmetic. Yes, he did purge much of the hard left. Yes, he did purge the most egregious anti-Semites and Israel bashers in the party. But the fact is that I would say the majority, if not the vast majority, of members of the Labour Party are now hostile to Israel on a scale ranging from disdain and dislike to vicious hostility. And there are a lot of anti-Semites in the party still. And there are also some hard left people that Starmer chose to retain. So it was a bit more of a mixed bag than he would like to everyone else to imagine. But in my view, the single most important factor about Keir Starmer, which is something that most people would not really immediately understand or acknowledge even in Britain, is this, that he is supposedly a moderate. He is, in fact, in most respects, I'm sure, a very decent man. He's very kind of solid and grounded. You don't look at him and think, oh, wild extremist, as you did with Jeremy Corbyn. However, Keir Starmer was, for most of his career, a human rights lawyer from one of the most radical barristers' sets in Britain. He was extremely left-wing, and he has not changed his position. So while that left-wing mindset doesn't take the form, as it did with Jeremy Corbyn, of supporting the world's Marxist dictators, of allying himself, as Jeremy Corbyn did, with known terrorist groups. Starmer wouldn't do that at all. He certainly wouldn't ally himself with terrorists, on the contrary. But on the other hand, he subscribes to a mindset which, in my view, is what I would call the human rights culture, which is the mindset that informs all the people in the West who are the most viciously hostile to Israel and condone or incentivize anti-Jewish hatred. For example, the United Nations and the United Nations Human Rights Council and all the organizations associated with the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the big NGOs like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and in Israel, B'Tselem. These are all institutions that march under the banner of human rights on the basis that human rights is an unchallengeable faith to do with basically bringing about the end of prejudice, the end of war, and bringing about the brotherhood of man. And that's Keir Starmer. And so if you take the view, as I do, that this culture of ostensibly moderate left-wingery is actually responsible for the animus against Israel, the insouciance, to put it no further than that, with which the mass anti-Semitism that we're seeing has taken hold of the world, plus all the wokery, the transgender lunacy, the offensive and culturally so suicidal doctrine that the entire Western world has to do penance for the colour of its skin, because white Westerners are responsible for all the ills of the developing world. They're colonialist, they're racist, and so on. If you think that those things are really terrible, well, I think that the human rights culture is absolutely at the root of all that. And that's Keir Starmer.
That's an important point, and especially since one of the most frightening possibilities of the next British government is that it may well be the incorporation of claims about Islamophobia, as well as those about gender ideology, into British human rights law, which could effectively ban criticism of radical and anti-Semitic Islamism, as well as critics of the trans madness. And in the British system, is there any check on Parliament's ability to ban speech if that's the way they go?
It's one of the glories of British democracy that Parliament is sovereign. Now, having said that, no one is above the law, and there are laws which, the English common law, human rights law, much as I dislike it, it's there. And, if you had an energetic opposition to this who wanted to use the courts, it's possible that some creative ways could be found of challenging it in the courts. But that's very much that's sort of very realistic proposition, I think. The fact is that Keir Starmer, his Labour government, has an enormous majority in Parliament, which we might want to talk about.
Yes.
But the paradox of this is that, for reasons I can explain, that enormous majority does not translate into an enormous majority of British people who support him and his agenda. Indeed, he has come to power with this enormous majority in Parliament, which means he's secure for the next 5 years. He can basically do what he likes. He's come to this position of great power on the basis of no greater than 20% of the people of Britain who voted for him, and something like just under a third of the people who actually voted, a third of the popular vote. It's one of the peculiarities of the British system that a party which has got 2/3 of the members of 2/3 of Parliament are now Labour members, Labour MPs, was elected on the basis of less than 1/3 of the popular vote. And the reason for that is that when people voted in last week's general election, they were voting from a position of stupendous disillusionment and disaffection with the entire political establishment. They'd had 14 years of a Conservative government, which in their view wasn't Conservative at all. It had not defended what needed to be defended. Public services had collapsed into incompetence and a certain amount of corruption. The place is literally swimming in sewage. The rivers and seas, the glory of this island nation that Britain is, are swimming in sewage. Such was the breakdown of the essential mechanisms of government. And also the Conservatives had not protected people against what they are so concerned about, which is what we've alluded to already, the transgender madness, the anti-white racism of the whole white people's privilege agenda. So they wanted out. They wanted the Conservatives out. They didn't just want them out. They wanted them destroyed. I mean, the level of anger in Britain at the Conservative government for having so badly let them down. Oh, and also the people who voted for Brexit, very important part of Britain's recent history, feel very let down by the Conservative government, which has not, for various reasons, taken advantage of the great opportunities that Brexit provided to put the country back on a trajectory of prosperity and advantage. And so there was a determination to get the Conservatives out and to destroy them. But they did not want necessarily to vote for Keir Starmer's Labour Party. They don't like Keir Starmer. They don't trust him. They think he's a slippery lawyer. They think that the party stands for all this wokery that I've just mentioned. And consequently, the Conservative vote collapsed. Now, the third element in all this, which has never happened before, was that there was a spoiler party called Reform. Reform is headed by a man called Nigel Farage, who is the most consequential politician in Britain probably since Margaret Thatcher. And the amazing thing about Nigel Farage is that until this general election of last week, he had tried 8 times to become a member of Parliament and had failed every time because the system does not allow third parties to come through. It is kind of institutionally prejudiced against third parties as a two-party system. Now, Nigel Farage was the man who basically incentivized and galvanized Britain to vote for Brexit in that referendum. And he came into this general election campaign, to put it mildly, at a late stage. It was 2 weeks after the election had been called that he decided to enter the fray, to stand for Parliament himself, and to assume leadership of the Reform Party. From that standing start, and with all the disadvantages and obstacles in the way of a third party by the British system, he nevertheless not only got himself elected as a Member of Parliament, but saw 4 of his colleagues, Reform people, members elected, which was a stupendous achievement. Now, what he did also was this, that people voted for him as an alternative to Labour to get the Tories out. And while he only has now 5 Reform members in Parliament, that collapse in the Conservative vote that went instead to his Reform Party accounted for the loss to the Conservative Party, which lost altogether something like 250 parliamentary seats, an enormous number, so that it's been reduced to a miserable little rump in Parliament. Of those 250 seats that it lost, Nigel Farage's Reform Party took 180 from them, because all those people who had voted Conservative in those constituencies voted for Reform. And so although Reform didn't win, they allowed Labour to win, which is a perverse result, you may think. But nevertheless, that's what happened. And so this is to speak to the point that, you know, with this enormous majority, Keir Starmer does not have a popular mandate for the kind of reforms he wants to put through, which in my view, even though relative to Jeremy Corbyn, he is a moderate, those reforms are not moderate at all.
That's a lot of interesting detail, and I'm glad you got into that. Let's stop for a moment and talk about what Starmer's government might do as far as Israel is concerned. Tell us about the new foreign minister. Is he much worse? Is he going to be much worse for Israel and for its interests than his predecessor, David Cameron? How different will Britain's stance on the Middle East conflict be? And is this really going to make much difference?
It is going to be different. It's going to be much worse. And the reasons for why this is happening, I'll come to in a moment. But you speak about the new foreign minister, David Lammy. David Lammy has already said, in fact, he said before the election, and he's repeated it since, he wants Britain to stop all arms sales to Israel. He supports the supported the attempt or the request by the International Criminal Court prosecutor for the court to issue arrest warrants for Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and says that if those arrest warrants are issued, Britain will arrest them if they come to Britain. Act of enormous hostility. One of Starmer's first approaches to foreign leaders was to speak on the telephone to Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority to assure him that the Palestinians had an absolute right to a Palestine state and that he, Starmer, was committed to such a thing. Whether he wants to identify a Palestine state before a negotiated settlement is left a bit vague, but he's implying that he would. He has said that he wants to increase the funding that Britain gives to the Palestinian Authority without apparently mentioning the fact that, or making it a condition, that in order to receive this extra funding, the PA has to stop pay for slay or to stop inciting its young people that they're to murder Jews and steal their land, nothing like that. And he then turned his attention to Mr. Netanyahu and proceeded to lecture him that he needed to bring in more humanitarian aid into Gaza. There needed to be an immediate ceasefire, which is in fact a surrender of Israel. And when it comes to the came to the attacks by the Hezbollah on the north of Israel, which, as we all know, much of the north of Israel has been burned to the ground. More than 60,000 residents of northern Israel have been effectively refugees in their own country for the last 9 months. There are missiles and rockets and drones coming virtually every day. Yesterday, a husband and wife were murdered in their car by such a rocket, leaving 3 orphaned children. In response to all of this, apparently Sir Keir Starmer said to Mr. Netanyahu that all parties have to proceed with caution, exercise caution. Now, what sort of caution is required to deal with genocide? And there was no sense there's been no sense by Starmer that what Israel is facing is not just war with Hamas and Hezbollah, bad as that is, but is war against Israel by Iran through their proxies. No sense of that whatsoever. So that was bad. And we've talked about David Lammy, the new foreign minister, who is not good at all. But there's even worse than David Lammy in the cabinet now. There are 2 particularly problematic appointments that Starmer has made. One is the new Lord Chancellor and Justice Secretary, a woman called Shabina Mahmood, who is a BDS supporter, a long-standing BDS supporter, and 5 days after the October 7 pogrom in Israel, was already warning of the humanitarian catastrophe and so on and so forth in Gaza. And the other deeply problematic appointment is the Attorney General, the government's most senior lawyer, who is, although a Jew, he's a member of a Reform synagogue, but he's a Tikkun Olam Jew, as he himself describes it, and has put his name to letters and legal opinions which are really quite viciously hostile to Israel's ability to defend itself. In response to the criticism he has sustained over these opinions he's given as a lawyer, he is a QC, he's a KC, I should say, King's Counsel, in another absolutely radical, and probably the most radical barristers set in Britain. In response to the criticism he has sustained, he has said, look, I'm a proud Jew, I have, I'm a member of a synagogue, I have dear relatives who are fighting in the IDF. And that's supposed to basically neutralize what he's actually been doing. So these appointments are extremely serious, because these 2, especially this Attorney General, who comes from, as I said, a very radical barrister set, and originally came from the radical barrister set that Keir Starmer was a member of. And there is a sense with Keir Starmer, you can see, he's appointing his chum, possibly more than one chum, to government, because they're all part of the same human rights fraternity, against which nothing could be said that's bad, because they're the human rights fraternity. They basically stand for all good things. I'm sure that's how Keir Starmer thinks. I don't know that. I've not talked to him about it, but I'm sure that's how he thinks, because that's how human rights lawyers always think. But anyway, this is really bad news. Will it matter? Does Britain matter? I think Britain does matter, actually. In many respects, I think that people in America may not realise or may not agree that Britain is as consequential as I think it is. Certainly is not as important as America. What America does is vital to Israel. But what Britain does is also important, not least because of the kind of cultural and diplomatic clout that Britain still has in the world. So yes, it matters.
Now, one of the interesting and troubling takeaways from this British election was the growing influence of sectarian voters, which is to say that the British Muslim population is now flexing its muscles in a way that makes it an important part of the Labour coalition, and actually far more important than Jews or supporters of Israel. This is something you were warning about back in the beginning of this century with your Londonistan book. How is this going to make itself felt in the next 5 years of the Starmer government, but also in British politics?
It's already making itself felt. There's great shock among wide swathes of the British public, including the Labour Party, about this. This Muslim bloc emerged a few months ago with a list of demands made to the Labour Party, which everyone knew was going to become the next government. And the Labour Party is historically the place where, it's the party where most Muslims cast their votes. And this bloc emerged with a list of demands, several of which were to do with, basically severing all relations with Israel, ending arms sales, casting it as a pariah state. But there were other demands to do with Islamizing Britain, adapting Britain to Islamic precepts, and people took a very dim view of that. That emerged in local municipal elections. So come the general election, and this took a very sinister turn indeed, because Labour candidates, ironically, many of them candidates who themselves had expressed extremely hostile views about Israel, and were entirely signed up to the Palestinian cause, were abused, harassed, intimidated, some with, violence in their homes, in their constituencies, on the hustings, in meetings, by Muslims furious at the Labour Party. Now, why were they so furious? Because after all, the Labour Party is fantastically pro-Palestinian. The reason was that the Labour Party isn't anti-Israel enough, because when October 7 happened, when the pogrom happened, Keir Starmer said immediately, Israel has the right to defend itself. And he said that repeatedly, and I'm sure he meant that. And he did not agree to the demand made by the Muslim community and his left wing that he should insist upon an immediate ceasefire. He said, that's it's just not possible. It's that surrender. I want a ceasefire in the fullness of time. And then over the months that passed since October 7, he came under more and more pressure, and the ceasefire became more and more immediate, and it became a kind of humanitarian ceasefire. He was weaseling about until he got to the point not that long ago where he said immediate ceasefire. Now, the Muslim community took a very, very dim view of this havering around. They wanted him basically to say, Israel is committing all these terrible offences, these terrible war crimes, and we must stop everything to do with supporting Israel. And he didn't. As a result, the Muslim vote collapsed. It collapsed. The Muslim vote for Labour collapsed. They harassed and intimidated Labour candidates. That was terrible. But what the Labour Party was so horrified by was that something like, I don't know what it was, I've forgotten quite the figure, but the drop in the Muslim vote for the Labour Party, it dropped by something like 23%. And the Labour Party lost, I think, 5 parliamentary seats, went to so-called independents, of whom Jeremy Corbyn was one, even though Jeremy Corbyn is not a Muslim. All these 5 independents fought this British general election, which is about British issues. They fought this election on the issue of Gaza-Palestine. And Labour lost 5 seats, and it came within a whisker in a number of other seats of losing. It hung on by its fingernails. This is extremely serious for the Labour Party. And it has said, we've got to get these people back again. I think Keir Starmer said, I am determined to bring you back. Okay. What's he going to do to bring them back? Nothing good, I'm afraid. Nothing good. It's going to be more kowtowing to the Islamizing agenda, or the Islamizing demands as far as the country in general is concerned. And it's going to be, without doubt, a further hardening of the British government's attitude towards Israel. Now, we'll see how far that goes. We don't know quite whether Keir Starmer really has a kind of backbone, whether he has a red line. We don't know where his red lines are. He is deliberately opaque. He fought the general election campaign. One of the reasons why people were so unhappy with him was that he was slippery. He didn't answer the question, or he kept changing his position depending on circumstances. So we actually don't know quite where he stands on all this. And I certainly wouldn't like to say whether he's going to kowtow to this agenda completely, whether he's going to resist it, find the backbone. He might. I don't know. But so far, it doesn't look good. There are 4 million Muslims in Britain, roughly speaking, according to official statistics, which I think are a little conservative. But anyway, that's the official number. And in terms of the Jewish community, in terms of those who identify as Jews, in other words, they belong to a synagogue, they're registered for a burial in a Jewish cemetery, whatever, like something like that, there's no more than 280,000. I mean, do the math. No contest. Would any political party choose to prioritize the Jewish community over 4 million Muslims, especially given the underlying and not so underlying threat of violence? And don't forget also, my final point on this is that this emergence of this Muslim political bloc comes on the heels of what we've seen in Britain as elsewhere, but what we've seen in Britain, which is so very striking, which is basically 9 months of Hamas supporting, Israel demonizing, anti-Jewish demonstrations of a vicious nature. And, the mass parading of the Palestinian flag, which people don't realize quite why Jews have such a problem when they see a load of people in the street marching with their Palestine flag. It's not just a flag. It's a bit like, I feel this when I go to London and I see this. It's a bit like seeing the streets of Britain taken over by Nazi insignia and Nazi symbolism. Because to me, Palestinianism is based on the eradication of Israel and the appropriation, the theft of Jewish cultural and historic identity in the land. And that's what the Palestine flag means to me, and I'm pretty sure it's what it means at some level to an awful lot of Jews. And yet this has been permitted, and there is an element to these demonstrations which is, the only way I can describe it is ecstatic and euphoric, because it's since October 7, they thought, you could feel it, and they said it, we've got them. We've got them. We have managed to slaughter all these Israelis in an Israel which thought it was impregnable. We've now shown it is vulnerable. And after that, we're now on course to destroy Israel. We're on course to destroy the Jewish people. And after that, we will destroy the Christian world. They say it, and you can feel it in the atmosphere. And that's why the confluence of this Muslim bloc, a Labour government which is likely to be quite sympathetic, because a lot of this a significant proportion of people in the party are from this Muslim bloc. The already visible signs of turning against Israel. This is why it's also frightening.
That's so true. You've alluded already to the fact that the Labour victory was enabled primarily by the failures of 14 years of Conservative government, collapse of faith in the Tories from much of their base, millions of whom defected to support the Reform Party this time because they failed to keep their promises about immigration and were in many ways largely indistinguishable from Labour, which is no longer the party of the working class, but rather kind of like the Democrats in the United States, the party of the poor and the party of the credentialed elites. While they absorbed the worst defeat ever, the Tories are still alive, but it's far from clear they've learned their lesson or will seek to make common cause with reform. I saw one column. I mean, I've heard many statements from Conservative MPs, the ones that survived, that they have no interest in dealing with reform. One example, not a member of Parliament, but frankly, former guest on this show and one of my favorite historians, Andrew Roberts, wrote a piece last week in which, he charted a future for the Conservative Party, which never mentioned the word immigration. Actually, he sought to take away the right to choose the Conservative Party leader from conservative voters. It doesn't seem like they've learned their lesson. And, it's a point I've made elsewhere that it strikes me that the Tories are kind of like if the Republicans right now in the United States were still led by Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan and, the strings were being pulled by Bill Kristol and the never-Trumpers. Where does that leave them going forward? And can they actually either merge with Farage and Reform or provide a coherent alternative to a hard left Labour government?
Well, they're in a really parlous state. They've been shattered into fragments, and they have no idea really how to proceed because they have no understanding of what they've done. They understand that the public are very angry with them. They understand, as you say, that the most important issue in all the incompetence and dereliction of duty that's taken place over the last 14 years, the most important is the failure to stop the irregular migrant trade in small boats across the Channel, across the English Channel from France, and the willed, and it was willed under Boris Johnson, the willed importation of legal immigrants to a level which is completely unsustainable in terms of public services and in terms of maintaining the Britain's national identity and culture. So they get that. The people who are left in Parliament, the majority of them are actually on the kind of liberal universalist wing of the party. And so they have absolutely no understanding of what's happened. On the contrary, they think that the reason why they've lost power is that the party was taken over by the right. This is absolutely ludicrous. The party was not taken over by the right. It was led by kind of social democrat, liberal universalists who went along with the flow of quite radical left-wing thinking. So that's complete nonsense. And the reason why they can't get it, and so that's the reason why Farage became Farage. That's the reason why his Reform Party has done so well, because what Farage it represents, and it's a bit like Trump, one doesn't have to like Farage. One can actually think that he's a pretty obnoxious character. One can think that some of the things he stands for, a bit like Trump, he's pretty isolationist, and so on. You can disapprove of those things that he stands for.
He's actually
and his policies.
Quite friendly with Trump.
He's very friendly with Trump. But what he articulated was precisely what the Conservative Party never understood that it had to articulate, which was a defense of the nation and its traditions and its culture, a defense of its borders to preserve that nation and its culture, a defense of its independence of action so that it really would take advantage of the separation from the EU to get going economically, and so on and so forth. And so that's why Farage has had the effect he's had, and he's going to continue to have it, because the Conservatives don't get it. First of all, there's a great resentment. Along comes Farage, and, he basically helps destroy them. So they're not exactly, primed to be sympathetic or open to what he stands for, because, he's only successful because they stopped standing for what he is standing for. So that's a very important factor. But I think there's a deeper problem that they have. I have been charting the collapse into ideological incoherence of the Conservative Party, and worse, really since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because I remember very clearly what happened. When the Soviet Union collapsed, and it was around that time that Tony Blair came to power, and I remember the Conservative Party sat around saying, my goodness me, what do we do now? We've shot our fox. The Soviet Union is no more. We've spent our entire time in the last century, broadly, defending the West, as it were, against Soviet communism. And now that's over. What do we do for an encore? What is the banner that we now must march behind? And they all said, oh, we have got to march behind the banner of liberty. And I thought at the time, oh my goodness, that is such a terrible mistake. Because, and I'm afraid it goes back to Mrs. Thatcher. Your viewers may be shocked to hear me say this, but in many ways, Mrs. Thatcher was not a conservative. She was what's called in Britain a Manchester liberal. She believed in liberal economics. It was Milton Friedman and Hayek. And it was basically, you unleash the free market and every problem goes away.
She was no follower of Edmund Burke.
She was not a follower of Edmund Burke, and she saw the world entirely through an economic prism. And she never realized until far too late that while she was busily opening up the market and everything, the left was making enormous cultural inroads in the schools and universities and the cultural elites in the opposite direction, by basically attacking the traditions and culture of Britain. Now, when the Conservative Party, post the implosion of the Soviet Union, decided to hang its hat on liberty, not only did they commit themselves to a kind of mechanistic economic view of the world, which didn't take account of the really important things that matter, which are the things that bind us together, tradition and culture and relationships and putting others above yourself and all that. But they went herring off down this road, and they didn't realize that liberty was in fact the patch of ideological turf upon which the left had planted itself. The left believed in liberty, i.e. the freedom of the individual to do what it liked in the social and cultural sphere. My lifestyle cannot be judged to be inferior to your lifestyle. I cannot. Everyone can make up their own way of life, their own morality. What is right for me is what is right. Radical individualism based on this ideal of personal liberty in the social sphere. And instead of opposing this and realizing that this was the way in which Western values, Western civilization was going to be undermined, the Conservatives adopted the same position in the economic sphere, economic liberty, free market. And consequently, there was a division that emerged within the Conservative Party between, on the one hand, the free marketeers, who were called the right, and on the other hand, the liberal universalists, who aped the left and were called one nation Tories. So the right were the people who were going to split the nation because they were horrible, they were prejudiced, they were divisive because they only believed in economics. There was some truth in that. And on the other hand, there are people of conscience and progress and modernity, and we believe in, the brotherhood of man, and we support international institutions, we support the United Nations, we support international law, and all of that. That was the division. nobody understood that there was a whole swathe of stuff in the middle which wasn't being attended to. And the other thing was that the so-called right of the party did not understand the point about immigration. They actually supported mass immigration because they believed that it would depress wages. They saw the world in economic terms only, and they saw immigration only in terms of economic opportunities, market opportunities. And so you had this unholy alliance between the so-called right, the free market right, who were happily bringing in large numbers of immigrants, and the universalist left in the Conservative Party, which was happily bringing in untold numbers of immigrants because they believed in multiculturalism. Otherwise, they thought, we as Conservatives risk being called the nasty party. That's exactly what a previous Prime Minister, Theresa May, said. She said, we can't be called the nasty party. And so she went herring off down the road of the left. So this was the division. And it was completely incoherent. And what was lost was this, fundamental need for Britain to reassert its traditions, its independence, its traditions, its culture, and uphold them, and uphold the integrity of the nation in a way that bound people together to restore the core values of British society that once had fostered gentility, civility, orderliness, rule of law, looking after each other. Britain was a very gentle, tolerant society, and it was the Conservatives who presided over its destruction, really.
That is an excellent explanation of a very complex topic. Thank you for that. And I might add that it's echoed by things that happen in the United States, where just as the city of London allies itself with the left in favor of mass immigration to get lower wages, Wall Street does the same here, which is why the Republican Party has sort of switched to being more of a working class party, because working class people understand that immigration hurts them. I'll just make a brief digression now into a discussion of democracy. We hear a lot in the United States, especially from people who don't like our electoral college, which is how we elect presidents in our constitutional republic, and how anti-democratic it is. But the British election results, and I might add the recent French election too, put the electoral college in the shade when it comes to reflecting the will of the voters. As you said, Labour got 34% of the vote, about 2/3 of the seats. In France, the far left got the least number of votes in the runoff, and the National Rally, the right-wing party, got the most, but in terms of seats, it's the opposite. And all that clearly, this inflates the importance of liberals in the British election, hurt reform, despite the latter outpolling the former. I doubt that with all the constitutional changes in the air from this Labour government, they're not going to embrace proportional representation because it so advantaged them to the existing system. But sort of does so. My two questions, sort of one serious, one not so serious, is does the emergence of British politics into an era when there are 4 or maybe 5 parties that can really get mass outpourings, does the British Constitution, which works so well in a 2-party system, still work as well? And I guess this also makes the crazy proportional system by which Israel elects its government, its Knesset, it seems almost rational now, even though we all agree that it's a terrible system.
It remains a terrible system. Notwithstanding everything, I remain absolutely certain that the first past the post system in Britain is still, like democracy itself, the least worst alternative. Of course, people can't help but be mortified by the disconnect between the popular vote and this overwhelming Labour majority in Parliament. And it does seem, from that point of view, unfair. But once you start looking at proportional representation, you get very quickly to a system in which everybody's vote counts in a way that it doesn't at the moment, you might say. But the result is that as a result of a governmental deal, a deal to form a government which is basically stitched up behind closed doors, so it's a complete absence of transparency. As a result of that, you have a situation in which very small parties can wield unconscionable power, and you can have the
which we see in Israel.
Which
for sure.
That's the problem. That's one of the problems in Israel. Successive governments have been held hostage by the ultra-Orthodox party. I mean, that's hardly a recipe for unifying the country. On the contrary, it's a recipe for profound division. And in Britain, we've talked about the emergence of this Muslim bloc. Can you imagine what would happen under proportional representation with a highly activist Islamic and Islamist minority? The prospects would be absolutely horrific. So you can't possibly go down that road. You have to hang on to this current situation. Yes, it's very unsatisfactory. Yes, when you look at France, there is Macron doing his deal with the devil. To stitch up this coalition involving some really terrible people on the ultra left, in order to keep out bad people. And so, they've gone from the frying pan into the fire. The people who thought that Marine Le Pen's party was, the spawn of the devil, have now managed to get the spawn of the devil. I mean, anyway, but we can all see also that this is profoundly unstable. It's unlikely to last. It's likely to lead to paralysis rather than anything else. Ultimately, these are imperfect systems. These are absolutely imperfect systems, as is democracy itself. But the alternative is worse, and I think we have to basically hang on to that idea. And certainly, as you say, the political system here in Israel is a terrible object lesson to anyone who thinks that we can all go down that road.
Yeah, very, very, very important conclusion to draw. You've been so prescient in many, anybody who reads Londonistan knows that, you have a good grip on things. I have a crystal ball. Unfortunately, it doesn't work very well. Just, sort of on one foot, what do you see the future of the British right? Does Nigel Farage wind up replacing, as he claims he wishes to do, replacing the Tories? Or does it just remain? Does the right remain split into the indefinite future, enabling really a long reign for the left?
I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. All the writing that I've ever done has been basically analysing what I'm seeing in front of me, which many people deny, and that's why it's been so striking. I wouldn't predict the future. I mean, Farage is not the antidote, not least because he actually believes in proportional representation.
Well, because that would have worked for him this time, yeah.
Yes. But I link the fortunes of the Conservative Party and Conservatives really across the West, who I think are in varying stages of difficulty, which takes different forms in different countries because the cultures are quite different, but they have certain similarities along the lines that we've been talking about. But I link the fortunes of the conservative movement, of conservatism in the West, to whether or not the West actually wants to survive. At the moment, the West does not want to survive. It has a death wish. It has told itself, or its elites have told itself, that it is rubbish, it is awful, it is evil, it was born in evil, it has to be replaced by something completely different, and is not producing children. It is literally dying. Now, having said that, it is the elites that are doing this, and the elites basically control the entire culture and the political establishment. However, we can now see millions of people are in revolt against that. You have the rise of so-called populist movements in Europe, which are basically the people saying, we're not putting up with this anymore. We want our culture and our countries back. We don't want mass immigration. We don't want all this nonsense about net zero and so on and so forth. You have the uprising in Britain with Nigel Farage and all the people who voted for him, and you have the convulsions in your own country, in America, We have a country that is deeply, deeply, deeply divided between the forces of the left that basically, I think, are out to destroy America, even though they may fondly imagine that's not what they're doing, that is what they're doing, and millions of people who can see what's happening, and they have a champion, we think. We think we think he's going to run, and so on and so forth. We can't predict, but they have a champion in Donald Trump, imperfect as he may be. And so everywhere you have people in revolt against this death wish that the West has. Now, I can't possibly say, none of us can say, how this is going to work out. We don't know whether a lot of people are going to come to their senses belatedly and get the show back on the road. We don't know whether there's going to be basically civil war in places between the forces of darkness and the forces of light. We don't know whether the West is just going to give up the ghost and just, go quietly into that good night. We have no idea. But the fact is, the situation is fluid because there are millions of people who don't want this, who do want to retain Western civilization, who do value it, who do understand what its value lies in, who do understand what is likely to be lost, and who want to have representatives who will defend it. And so I think everything is to play for. Everything is in flux. At the moment, it seems like, Britain, and certainly the situation facing the state of Israel in terms of the region, and in terms of the Biden administration's appeasement of evil people, it seems to me like the bad people are winning all over the place. And so it's very hard to retain an optimistic sense that we're all going to pull through this. And yet I am ridiculously optimistic. I think it's because I live in Israel and because we have to be optimistic because, first of all, we have no alternative if we're not all going to basically go under. But secondly, because we know that the Jewish people has outlived all its enemies at terrible cost, unfortunately, and that's a terrible thing. What's coming down the road may be even more terrible cost than Israel has already paid. But ultimately, I'm pretty sure, and I think the vast majority of people here in Israel are pretty sure, that ultimately Israel will survive and the Jewish people will survive. And that cannot be said at the moment for the West. And until the conservative movement in the West understands that its one role in life, if they are to be conservatives, is to conserve what is of value and of priceless value about Western civilization, to understand what it is they have to conserve, to understand what the danger is that it's in, to understand the nature and style and reach of the people who are trying to destroy it. Unless and until the conservative movement understands that, then it's not going to be in any position to survive because it won't have defended Western civilization.
Well said. Well said. Let's turn briefly, just a moment, because we don't have that much time left, to France. In the second round of the parliamentary elections, the French left scored a victory. The right-wing National Rally, led by Marine Le Pen, finished third, despite getting the most votes. Given that the left is deeply tainted by anti-Semitism and beholden to the growing percentage of the population that is Muslim, far more even than Britain, that raises questions about the future in France. Certainly, as you say, both Reform in the UK and National Rally in France have made gains. But there are, the growing movement to halt unlimited immigration, the influence of Islam throughout Europe, is somewhat on the upswing elsewhere in Netherlands. But more to the point for our discussion, do you think European Jews are starting to realize that their traditional fears of the right and its anti-Semitic past pale before the clear and present danger to them and to Israel from the anti-Semitic left and the bizarre red-green alliance of Marxists and Islamists?
I think in France, a lot of Jews have reached that conclusion. I think it was the chief rabbi of France who said, look, he said Jews should get out. because the situation is so dangerous. And he said, it doesn't really matter whether it's Le Pen or the left. Either way, both sides are a danger to us in France. And I think a lot of Western Jews, and this is particularly so, I think, in America, but it's also true in Britain. I don't know so much about France because France, it's so violent. The Muslim population there is so violent. They have been
as they demonstrated after their side won the election by rioting
exactly
in Paris.
Exactly. It is a revolutionary society. Always was, and remains. And the Muslim population is not like the Muslim population in Britain or indeed America. It is extremely violent, and Jews have been murdered. A number of Jews have been murdered, and the level of violence is very frightening in France. So I think that the French Jews, that they can see that the right is not the problem. On the other hand, they are understandably concerned about Marine Le Pen and the background that she comes from and that her party comes from, because clearly there are anti-Semites on the right, and her party has an unsavory history. So they're really caught between like the devil and the deep blue sea. When it comes to Britain, I think that the majority of British Jews really don't get it. They flocked back to Keir Starmer's Labour Party. They believed the spin. They saw, the purge that he carried out, and they said, yeah, okay, it's fine. We're okay now, because they don't get it. They don't understand the dangers that exist. They don't understand, in particular, the danger from the Islamic world. They are absolutely programmed to see British Muslims as just like their ancestors were, their grandparents and great-grandparents when they came to Britain, and they also had funny clothes, and they also had funny customs, and they were also the victims of, they were also poor, and they were the victims of prejudice and so on, and they were just like us. They don't get it. And indeed, the Jewish, we've talked about this before, I think, but the Jewish community leadership in Britain just never, ever, ever discusses Muslim anti-Semitism, which is off the scale everywhere, in the Muslim world, and no less in Britain. And anyone who tries to discuss it, like me, is regarded by the Jewish community leadership as an Islamophobe and basically, shut down. And so
Islamophobia basically is just calling out Muslim anti-Semitism.
Well, precisely. I think the British Jews still think that the main threat comes from the right, because they see the left as basically benign. They look at Keir Starmer and think he's basically benign. And he's a benign guy. He's a decent guy in very many respects. They looked at Jeremy Corbyn and they got very frightened. They got very frightened. But now, so that was, before the election, they all went back to voting for the left. Now, just a week on, I guess there's a certain amount of buyer's remorse already setting in. They can see what's happening. They can see the signals. You'd have to be, absolutely with your head in the sand not to see the signals. But they're probably all still thinking, well, it'll settle down. It'll be okay. Keir Starmer really, he won't go down this road so far. And so he's a bit more unfriendly to Israel. So what? So what? So I think that the British Jews are still very, very complacent. Having said that, I'm aware of a very large number in that community who are very, very worried and very frightened by what's going on. I don't think they think of it in terms of left-right. I think they just think, all these Muslims and left-wing people on the streets with their Palestine flags, and we're not being, our safety is not being looked after by the government. That was the previous government. And they are extremely concerned. There are a lot of people who are thinking about coming to Israel. They have, they have ties, family, jobs, and so on. It makes it very difficult. And the level of fear and pain is not big enough yet for them to come in great number. And I very much hope it will never be big enough yet. I don't think, for all these reasons, people, if what's coming down the pike is so frightening, people tend to look away, and they tend to take refuge in fantasies, fictions that they tell themselves it'll be okay, and so on. And it's perfectly true that large numbers of British Muslims are perfectly acculturated to British ways and are no threat to anybody. But the problem is there are so many who are not. And if you have an entire establishment to which diaspora Jews are always so keenly attuned to what they think, if you have an entire establishment that says, as it still says, that anyone who calls out an Islamic threat in Britain, anyone who opposes mass immigration, anyone who says that it's wrong for the culture to be lost like this, anyone who says that it was wrong for Britain to dissociate itself, to leave the European Union, because we can only be strong if we're united in the brotherhood of man. If you have an entire establishment saying that, then the Jewish community, which is, as I say, sensitive to public consensus, never wants to buck the consensus. It goes along with that consensus.
Yeah, British Jews tend to be much less assertive than American Jews in terms of standing up for their interests.
Well, you say that. And that is
although
I'm
a great critic of much of the American Jewish leadership, but even by comparison,
but they have gone. They go along with the left wing consensus. Most of them, they vote for them. Until this election, the British Jews didn't vote broadly for the left. They broadly voted Conservative, and that flipped at this election, just like the rest of the country flipped, because it couldn't stand the Conservatives anymore for all the reasons that we've been discussing. But I would suspect that for the British Jews, it was more a question of the perception, which is correct, of utter incompetence. You couldn't trust these people in the Conservative Party to run a Welsh stall, more than the immigration thing, because the British Jews are like, we were all immigrants and, we should let them all in. And so they really, really don't get it at that level. It's troubling because, whatever people decide to do, whether they decide to stay or leave, I do very, very firmly believe that people have to be connected to reality and not put their heads in the sand and not live in a world of fantasy. That way lies ruin. And I fear that a lot of British Jews are in that position.
Yeah. Well, last question, briefly. I'd like to ask you what you see from a British and Israeli perspective about the American election, the implications for the future of our foreign policy and its impact on the world. As the Trump-Biden race, and I'm of the opinion and have always have been that despite the cries of pain from the Democratic Party, they're still stuck with Joe Biden, on the world as you see it. Where do you see this going in terms of the implications of possible change?
Well, look, I have a rather black and white view of this now, and I just believe that it's a kind of moral duty of people to vote against the left wherever they are, because I believe that the left are a real danger to Western civilization wherever they are. And that, if that sounds harsh and too blankety and too sort of, without nuance, I'm sorry. But ultimately, it's a choice. And I believe the Americans are about to make that choice, and it's a fateful choice. Do I look forward to a Trump presidency on the basis that it will actually deliver us all from evil? No. I think it's absolutely a petrifying prospect. Trump 1 was rickety enough, but I think he actually governed like a regular Republican, actually, in most respects, despite his personal style. Trump 2 is a completely different matter. We don't know. We can all see what happened in the last few years, and we don't know how he has changed. But at least there is a prospect that he can keep the show on the road in terms of America's prosperity, in terms of American really the rule of law, and not just the rule of law, but the rule of rationality. When it comes to Israel, I hope that he would be as sympathetic as he was. He obviously has a bit of bit of an issue with Netanyahu. What worries me about Trump is his isolationism. And, you know, this idea that all politics is a matter of doing a deal, and that we saw this with Trump 1. He could do the deal with Putin. He can do the deal with Xi. He can do the deal with North Korea. He can do the deal with the Palestinians. It's not a matter of deals. It's a matter of defeating the forces of evil, frankly. And anyway, so that worries me. However, when I look at the Democrats, to me, the Biden administration is a continuation of the Obama doctrine, which at the very best was inept in terms of its analysis of the world. This apparent belief that, Iran had to be empowered in order to provide an alternative focus of power to both nuclear Israel and Saudi Arabia. And if you had that balance of power in the Middle East, then all would be well, because they would have to get on with each other. I mean, so completely lunatic was that idea that I never believed that to be true. And the more cynical and the more unpleasant view of the Obama doctrine was that he simply hated white people, and he hated white society, and he hated the West, and he wanted to basically empower the not West. Whichever it was very, very bad for the West, and I regard the Biden administration as being a continuation of his doctrine, with a lot of his retreads in the administration. And if Biden came to power again, it would be basically Obama's 4th term. If Biden were to step down, well, you will know better than I who the runners and riders, the most likely runners and riders are. The prospect of President Kamala Harris fills me with complete horror. And I just don't see any Democrat who would actually do what is necessary, which is basically defend Western civilization against the forces of evil. So I think that it's, if the left wins in America, then Israel is in for a very, very harder time than it is even now. And America is in for a very bad time as well. And, I would like to see, the American sense of its own exceptionalism restored to it, because I think that was very important. America, so powerful, used its power once to do good in the world and to spread freedom and democracy and all that sort of stuff. I would like to see that return. How do I see, the future? I mean, I view it with enormous concern and a tremendous amount of fear, not least because of Israel, because, in order to fight, to defend Israel, it has to fight Iran. There are no two ways about it. In order to defend the West, America has to learn this, Britain has to learn this, Israel knows it. If the West is to be defended against these forces of evil which Iran has amassed behind it, Iran has to be neutralized as the head of the snake. Much talk in Israel, as you know, of, it's only a matter of days, weeks, whatever, before Israel really has to unleash the forces of full war against the Hezbollah. Okay, we can all see why. The situation is absolutely intolerable in the north. It's being attacked every day. People are dying. The place is burning. 60,000 refugees. Israel's been sliced off effectively at the top. It's intolerable. Can't carry on like this. But we all know that if Israel really goes for Hezbollah, Iran is likely to unleash, and it's likely to unleash its proxies in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, and in the disputed territories of Judea and Samaria, who are continually attacking all the time as we speak, in any event. Now, the only way in which Israel can forestall that, in my view, is to go for Iran either before or at the same time as Hezbollah. Either way, if it does that, or if it just goes for the Hezbollah and gets Iran unleashed as a result, it has to have American support. America has to come to Israel's aid. I'm not sure whether the Biden administration would do so, and certainly not before an election. On the other hand, Iran knows perfectly well this is a situation. This is the most dangerous time of all. Between now and certainly between now and November, and possibly even until January when the new president gets sworn in, this is Iran's chance. It may not have this chance again. And so it becomes fantastically dangerous that Iran may really unleash now, that Hezbollah may really unleash now on the basis that Israel can't do anything because it's not going to have American support. Everything comes back to this point, that over the past several years, America has refused to acknowledge that what it has to do is to neutralize Iran, not necessarily by war over those years. It could have done so, and it did so to a certain extent under Trump, by sanctions, by starving them of money. It should do so by diplomatic means, by ostracizing them. There are many ways you could, basically tell Iran that you're serious. The reason why Iran is behaving as it is because it is absolutely certain, as is President Xi in China, as is Putin in his war in Ukraine. They're absolutely certain that America will not go to war. And if you don't threaten war credibly, you lose, you surrender. The bad guys win. That's why the bad guys are winning. So that's what has to be done. Iran has to be taken on. Otherwise, we're not going to win this. Will that happen? I do not know.
Well, that's a sobering thought to end on. Melanie, thanks so much for coming on today and for all of your insights on these issues. You can read Melanie's weekly JNS column at jns.org, and you should also subscribe to her Substack, as I do, by going to melaniephillips.substack.com. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition. Whether you're listening to us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.